12:01 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a 50% tariff on nearly $20 billion of Canadian goods became law. Wine bottles, hockey sticks, bags of cement, furniture rolling off assembly lines in Ontario. All of it, as of today, August the 19th, 2026, carries a 50% tax the moment it crosses into the United States. But buried inside the legal foundation of that tariff sits a fracture that trade lawyers, scholars, and government officials in Ottawa have been quietly circling for weeks. A fracture that could, if it holds up in court, undo the entire thing. This is not a story about a secret Canadian trick discovered in the last 60 minutes. It's something more interesting than that. It's the story of a law that hasn't been used in almost a century, dusted off by an American president who needed it to survive a Supreme Court defeat, and the legal cracks in that law that are now wide open for the world to see, right as the tariff itself goes live. Here's why this matters, and why it matters right now. The tariff is real. It's in effect. Canadian exporters are absorbing it today. But the tool the Trump administration used to build it, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, has never been tested. Not once. Not in 96 years. And that untested status is exactly the vulnerability at the center of this story. Let's rewind, because the background here is what makes the present moment make sense. Earlier this year, the Trump administration was leaning on a completely different law to justify its sweeping global tariffs, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IEEPA. That law had been the engine behind the president's so-called Liberation Day tariffs, the blanket duties slapped on dozens of countries at once, Canada included. But on February the 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ended that. The justices ruled the IEEPA tariffs unlawful, finding that the emergency powers law had been stretched well beyond what Congress had actually authorized. According to reporting from law firms Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, that ruling didn't just strike down one tariff, it forced the entire Trump trade team back to the drawing board, sending them hunting through the U.S. Code for older, more obscure statutes that might survive the same kind of legal scrutiny. To understand why the administration needed a new legal foundation at all, it helps to walk through how we got here. This trade fight didn't start in July. It stretches back to early 2025, when the president first imposed a blanket 25% tariff on a wide range of Canadian goods, followed by 50% global tariffs on steel and aluminum. Canada matched with its own retaliatory tariffs on American vehicles and industrial products. By April of that year, the administration rolled out what it called Liberation Day, a 10% universal tariff on nearly all imported goods worldwide, with steeper reciprocal rates for specific countries. Canada and Mexico were initially spared the flat 10%, but still faced 25% duties on anything not covered by USMCA. Then, in July of 2025, the president sent Prime Minister Carney a public letter posted to his social media platform announcing a 35% tariff on Canadian goods starting August the 1st, tied partly to unproven claims about fentanyl trafficking across the northern border, despite government data showing only a marginal share of the drug actually enters the U.S. that way. Canada responded that August by removing many of its own retaliatory tariffs on American goods as a goodwill gesture, while keeping tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum in place. That back and forth continued for months, through provincial premiers meetings, phone calls, and a G7 summit sit-down between Carney and Trump in Evian-les-Bains, France, where the two leaders agreed to pursue a broader deal within 30 days. It didn't happen in 30 days. It's now been well over a year of escalation, retaliation, and partial de-escalation, and today's Section 338 tariff is simply the newest chapter. Layered on top of all that was a separate 10% global tariff imposed under yet another law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which the administration used as a stopgap after the IEEPA ruling. That Section 122 tariff, according to Holland and Knight's analysis, actually expired on its own on July the 24th, 2026, because the statute caps how long a Section 122 action can run without separate congressional approval. That expiration is part of why the administration reached for Section 338 in the first place. Section 122 has a hard time limit, but Section 338 doesn't. According to a piece published through Yahoo Finance citing Freight Waves analysis, trade experts described Section 122 and Section 338 as the administration's two remaining legal constitutional tools after the Supreme Court closed the IEEPA door. Tools that sidestep the specific reasoning the justices used to strike down the emergency powers tariffs, because Section 122 and Section 338 come from Congress directly rather than from an emergency declaration. That hunt is what led them to Section 338. It's a provision buried in the original 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the same law economists have blamed for deepening the Great Depression by choking off international trade. Section 338 lets a president impose tariffs of up to 50% on any country found to be discriminating against American commerce. It sat completely unused for generations. Analysis published on the World Trade Law blog notes that one plausible explanation for its disappearance from public use after 1949 is that the non-discrimination principles baked into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, starting that same year, effectively made Section 338 redundant. For more than 75 years, nobody needed it. Then, on July the 20th, 2026, President Trump became the first president in American history to actually invoke it. He signed 3 separate proclamations that day, all aimed at Canada. According to a White House fact sheet released alongside the announcement, the administration accused Canada of discriminatory trade practices in 3 specific sectors: motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy. On autos, the complaint centers on Canada's 25% retaliatory tariff on American-made vehicles, first imposed after Washington's own auto tariffs earlier in the trade fight. On alcohol, the White House pointed to what it called a near-total collapse in Canadian purchases of American liquor. The fact sheet claims Canadian imports of U.S. alcoholic beverages fell by roughly 81%, or $582 million, between March of 2025 and February of 2026, compared with the same period the year before. That drop followed several Canadian provinces pulling American alcohol off liquor store shelves entirely, a retaliatory move after the initial round of Trump tariffs. And on dairy, the administration's complaint is more technical. It argues Canada set tighter tariff rate quotas on American cheese than it grants the European Union under a separate trade agreement, even though Canada has trade deals with both. Legal filings and analysis from the law firm Holland and Knight lay out just how sweeping these 3 proclamations actually are. Collectively, according to the U.S. Trade Representative's own estimate, they cover close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports, spread across hundreds of individual tariff classifications. And here's the detail that caught almost every trade lawyer off guard. Unlike nearly every previous round of tariffs in this multi-year trade fight, these ones ignore the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement entirely. A valid USMCA certificate of origin, the document that has shielded qualifying Canadian goods from earlier tariffs, does nothing here. If a product appears on one of the 3 annexed lists, it pays the 50%, full stop, whether or not it was ever supposed to cross the border duty-free under the very trade agreement all 3 countries signed. That detail alone reshapes the stakes for thousands of businesses on both sides of the border. Analysis from Thomson Reuters' Tax and Trade Division points out that the tariffs reach well beyond the 3 headline sectors. Chapters 84 and 85 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, the machinery and electrical equipment categories, are swept in too, meaning everything from industrial components to networking hardware and server equipment can get caught in the net, even if the shipment has nothing to do with cars, wine, or cheese. Furniture, paper products, plywood, and cement all show up on the lists as well. A handful of categories are carved out, including energy products, potash, fish, and critical minerals, along with anything already covered under separate Section 232 tariffs, meaning steel, aluminum, copper, and the auto sector's existing metal tariffs stay on their own separate track rather than stacking under Section 338. But for the goods that are covered, there's no relief, and the 50% stacks directly on top of whatever duties, taxes, and fees a shipment already owed. It doesn't replace them. It adds to them. Now here is where the real story, the legal fracture, comes into focus. Because Section 338 wasn't just dusted off and used freely. It came with conditions written into the statute itself, conditions nobody has ever had to test in court, because nobody has ever invoked this law before. And multiple legal scholars are now arguing those untested conditions may not have been met. The statute directs something called the International Trade Commission, the ITC, to, in the law's own words, ascertain and at all times be informed about whether a foreign country is discriminating against American commerce, and to bring that finding to the President's attention, along with formal recommendations. According to the Holland and Knight analysis, it remains an open legal question whether that ITC investigation is a mandatory first step the President has to complete before he can act, or whether it's simply a background reporting function that doesn't legally bind the administration's hands. If a court eventually finds that the ITC investigation was a legal precondition, and if it never happened in the form the statute requires, that alone could be enough to unwind all 3 proclamations. There's a second, deeper argument circulating among trade law scholars, and it comes from 2 of the very people who helped build the legal case that brought down the IEEPA tariffs in the first place. Peter Harrell, a visiting scholar at Georgetown's Institute for International Economic Law, and Jennifer Hillman, a professor of practice at Georgetown Law and co-director of the university's Center for Inclusive Trade and Development, published an analysis arguing that Section 338 may have been effectively superseded by later trade law, specifically Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, the modern statute Congress built to handle exactly these kinds of discrimination and retaliation disputes. Their argument, published through the World Trade Institute Alliance and highlighted by legal commentator Ilya Somin, is that when Congress created Section 301 in 1974, it intended for that newer, more procedurally constrained law to become the primary tool for addressing unfair foreign trade practices, effectively retiring Section 338 in substance, even if Congress never formally repealed it from the books. It's also worth understanding just how far this law could still go if it survives. The statute doesn't stop at 50%. According to the Holland and Knight analysis, Section 338, subsection B, actually authorizes the president to escalate further, up to and including a full import ban, if the administration determines Canada is maintaining or increasing the discrimination the tariffs were meant to punish. That means today's 50% isn't necessarily the ceiling. It's simply where things stand right now, 30 days after the proclamations were signed, which the statute treats as the minimum notice period before a Section 338 tariff can take effect. If the current negotiating track collapses instead of producing a deal, that escalation clause is the next lever available to the administration. And it's a lever nobody has ever seen pulled because nobody has ever gotten this far into a Section 338 action before. There's also a former Trump-era official's read on the strategic thinking behind reaching for this specific dormant law. Kellyanne Shaw, a former senior White House trade advisor, told The Hill that by launching the Section 338 tariffs, the administration was shifting the board game and trying to unlock a long-standing stalemate. That's a telling way to frame it, not as a routine enforcement action, but as a deliberate attempt to change the entire shape of the negotiation by introducing a tool with no legal track record and, therefore, no obvious ceiling on how aggressively it could still be used. Not every legal voice agrees. Jed Rubenfeld, a law professor at Yale, has staked out the opposite position. In a piece published in the Free Press and excerpted on the legal blog, The Volokh Conspiracy, Rubenfeld, who represented the America First Policy Institute in briefs supporting the government's side during the IEEPA litigation, argues that if Congress had wanted to strip the president of the power to impose tariffs in response to unfair discrimination, it would have said so explicitly somewhere in the text. He views Section 338 as a live, standing grant of authority that Section 301 simply supplemented rather than replaced. That disagreement between credible legal scholars is exactly why this is described as an open question rather than a settled one. And it's worth being direct about that here rather than pretending the law is clearly on one side. What both camps agree on is this: nobody knows how a court will rule because nobody has ever forced a court to rule on Section 338 before. Analysis from the international law firm White and Case frames the current moment plainly, describing the July proclamations as a significant and legally unprecedented escalation, and raising the possibility that the administration may effectively be using Canada as a test case. If Section 338 survives a legal challenge, it becomes a faster, more durable tool than Section 301 has ever been for imposing tariffs going forward, not just against Canada, but potentially against any trading partner. That's a notable stake. This isn't only about wine and hockey sticks. It's about whether the executive branch just found a new, more resilient way to impose broad tariffs without needing Congress or surviving the kind of legal challenge that just took down the IEEPA tariffs 7 months ago. As of the most recent legal commentary available, including analysis published on the Tax Prof blog citing trade law experts, no formal lawsuit challenging the Section 338 tariffs on Canada had actually been filed. Legal challenges are described as anticipated, expected, likely, actively being prepared, but not yet in front of a judge. That's an important distinction to sit with. The vulnerability is real, and it's being taken seriously by serious legal minds. But a vulnerability sitting on paper is not the same as a court order striking the tariff down. Nothing has been overturned. Not yet. While the legal fight brews, there's a second track running in parallel, and it's arguably moving faster: the negotiating table. Ottawa and Washington have been locked in an intense, accelerating round of talks in the weeks leading up to today's deadline. Reuters reported on August the 13th that a Canadian government source directly familiar with the negotiations said talks were progressing well, and that Washington, too, wanted an agreement in place before the tariffs took effect. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, met repeatedly with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer through the second week of August, 4 meetings in 3 weeks, according to that same reporting, alongside Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette. According to reporting from the Globe and Mail on August the 16th, the outline of a possible deal had taken shape by that point. Trump would lower tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products, in exchange for Canada making concessions on alcohol access, dairy quotas, and government procurement rules. Critically, That same reporting indicated the agreement, if finalized, could see the president back off the very Section 338 threat that's now in effect, rolling back the new tariffs on electronics, alcohol, and dairy that took hold at midnight. As of that reporting, the deal was described as taking shape, not signed. The final stretch got personal. Al Jazeera reported that Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Trump spoke by phone twice in the 2 days immediately before today's deadline, once Monday evening, once again Tuesday afternoon, with Carney's office confirming the calls, but declining to detail what was said. CNBC reported that the Monday night conversation did not convince the president to hold off on the tariffs taking effect, citing Fox Business reporting on the state of the talks. According to Reuters, one of the central sticking points has been how to calculate the American content in a Canadian-built vehicle for the purposes of any reduced auto tariff. Washington wants to count only parts actually produced in the U.S. While Canada is pushing to count broader North American content, Canadian-made components included. That single technical disagreement over car parts has been enough to stall an otherwise advancing deal. Prime Minister Carney has been consistent in public about where he's willing to draw the line. He's repeated a version of the same phrase for months now, most recently at a gathering of Canada's provincial premiers. Canada will not accept a bad deal. According to Bloomberg's reporting on that appearance, Carney framed the negotiating posture as one where reaching an agreement is not the goal in itself. The goal is an agreement that actually serves Canadian interests, even if that means walking away from the table longer than Washington would like. Not everyone in Ottawa's orbit shares the same read on how close a deal really is. David McNaughton, Canada's former ambassador to the United States, told BNN Bloomberg that while Canada has put together a substantial package of proposals, he isn't convinced the American side is actually ready to close a comprehensive agreement. At the end of the day, the only person that's going to make the final deal is going to be the president, McNaughton said, according to that reporting. And I'm not sure that he's ready right now to do a comprehensive deal, which is really what the Canadian side want. He also cautioned against Ottawa making piecemeal concessions without securing the full package in return. There's political texture to this fight inside Canada, too. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a frequent critic of the American president's trade approach, told reporters he'd be more than happy to bring American alcohol back onto Ontario shelves if a fair deal is reached, one that protects the province's steel, auto, forestry, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors. Ford's message to Americans, as reported by Global News, was blunt. A tariff on Canada is a tax on the American people. Meanwhile, federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has said any new trade deal must also address softwood lumber tariffs, a long-running sore spot in the relationship that predates this entire fight by decades. It's also worth being precise about what the alcohol dispute actually looks like on the ground, because it's the sector where retaliation has been most visible to ordinary consumers on both sides of the border. After the initial rounds of Trump tariffs in 2025, several Canadian provincial liquor authorities pulled American wine, beer, and spirits off store shelves entirely. A political statement as much as an economic one, since provincial governments in Canada, not the federal government in Ottawa, actually control retail alcohol sales. That provincial-level retaliation is part of why the White House's 81% import decline figure looks so dramatic. It's not the result of a single federal policy, but of a patchwork of provincial boycotts stacking on top of each other. It's also why any resolution on alcohol has to run through premiers like Doug Ford in Ontario, not just through Carney's federal government in Ottawa, which is precisely why Ford's comments about being more than happy to restock American liquor carry real weight in these negotiations. He's not a bystander commenting on federal policy. He's one of the people who would actually have to reverse the boycott for any deal to function as advertised. On the American side, there's real concern from business groups about what happens if no deal materializes. Neil Harrington, Senior Vice President for the Americas at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, said in a statement reported by CNBC that new, higher tariffs would damage both economies, drive up costs for U.S. families, further disrupt critical supply chains, and risk the 13 million American jobs that depend on trade under the USMCA framework. That's a striking number to sit with. 13 million American jobs tied, in the Chamber's framing, to the health of the very trade relationship these tariffs are straining. The dairy piece of this dispute deserves a closer look too, because it's the most technical of the three complaints and the one least likely to make headlines on its own. Canada operates what's called a tariff rate quota system on dairy products like cheese, a set volume of imports allowed in at a low or zero tariff rate, with anything above that volume taxed heavily. The White House's complaint isn't that Canada blocks American cheese outright. It's that the volume Canada allows in from the United States at the preferential rate is smaller and the eligibility rules stricter than the volume and rules Canada extends to the European Union under a separate agreement called CETA, the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Multiple legal analyses reviewed for this script describe this as, on paper, the simplest of the three disputes to resolve. It's a quota allocation problem that could theoretically be renegotiated within the existing USMCA review process, rather than something requiring an entirely new legal framework. The complication isn't technical, it's political. Canada's dairy supply management system is one of the most fiercely protected sectors in Canadian politics, defended by farmers, provincial governments, and federal parties across the spectrum for decades. Any concession on dairy access carries a domestic political cost in Canada that's disproportionate to the actual dollar value of the trade at stake. There's also a smaller, more technical loophole tucked inside the mechanics of the rollout, one that matters enormously to importers, even if it doesn't touch the broader legal question. Analysis from Thomson Reuters flagged what it called a procedural trap: goods sitting inside a U. S foreign trade zone generally needed to be formally admitted under something called privileged foreign status before today's effective date, or they inherit the new 50% duty anyway once they're eventually withdrawn for consumption. It's an easy detail to miss. A compliance team could review the headline categories, autos, alcohol, dairy, confirm their exposure looks manageable, and move on, only to discover weeks later that a shipment of Canadian furniture or plywood sitting in a bonded warehouse got caught by a rule nobody thought to check because it never made a single headline. That's not a loophole that helps Canada escape the tariff. If anything, it's the opposite. A narrow procedural window that rewarded importers who moved fast and quietly and closed for everyone else the moment the clock struck midnight in Ottawa's time zone this morning, matching Washington's. And there is a broader structural question hanging over all of this that goes beyond any single tariff. The Trump administration confirmed last month that it does not intend to renew the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement in its current form, triggering a formal review process for the entire trilateral deal, according to reporting reviewed in this research. That puts the future of USMCA itself, not just this one round of Section 338 tariffs, into a period of uncertainty. Analysis from White and Case raises exactly this point. Beyond the immediate dispute over autos, alcohol, and dairy, the broader question is what today's tariff means for the durability of the USMCA framework as the three countries head into a new and unresolved phase of renegotiation. It's worth pausing on the scale of what's actually exposed here, because the $20 billion headline number can obscure how concentrated the pain is likely to be. Canada sends roughly 3/4 of everything it exports to the United States, a dependency that goes back generations of integrated supply chains, especially in the auto sector, where parts can cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. That's part of why the auto content counting dispute in the ongoing negotiations matters so much. It's not an abstract accounting question. It's the difference between a Canadian-assembled vehicle qualifying for a reduced tariff rate or not, multiplied across an entire manufacturing sector concentrated in Ontario. Analysts covering the retail and consumer side of this dispute, including reporting picked up by Yahoo Finance Canada, have noted that ordinary Canadian shoppers are likely to feel ripple effects too, even though the headline tariff technically applies to what the U.S. charges on Canadian goods coming in, not the reverse, because any Canadian concessions made to secure a deal on things like provincial alcohol bans or auto tariffs show up eventually in what's available and what it costs on Canadian shelves and car lots. So where does that leave things as of right now, this morning, with the tariff already in force? A few things are confirmed, verified, and not in dispute. The 50% Section 338 tariffs on the listed Canadian goods took effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time today, August the 19th, 2026. USMCA compliance does not exempt covered goods. The tariffs stack on top of existing duties. Roughly $20 billion in annual Canadian imports are affected. This is the first time in the tariff's 96-year history that Section 338 has actually been used. Other things remain genuinely open, and it would be dishonest to present them as settled. No lawsuit challenging the tariffs had been filed as of the most recent legal reporting reviewed for this script, even though legal challenges are widely expected. No court has ruled on whether the ITC investigation requirement was a binding precondition, or whether Section 301 legally superseded Section 338. Credible scholars disagree on both points, and no final trade deal between Ottawa and Washington had been publicly confirmed as signed, even though negotiators from both sides described themselves in the final hours before the deadline as making real progress toward one. That's the honest shape of this story right now. A tariff that is legally live, but potentially legally fragile. A negotiation that is close, but not finished. A law from 1930 being tested in real time, with the outcome genuinely unknown to everyone involved, including, it's worth saying plainly, the government officials writing the checks and the compliance departments recalculating landed costs in Ottawa and across the American Midwest this very morning. One more thing worth naming plainly before we wrap this up. Uncertainty itself has a cost, separate from whatever a court or a negotiator eventually decides. CNBC's reporting noted that business leaders have warned the mere threat of these tariffs, in the weeks leading up to today, already generated significant uncertainty and measurably affected sales on both sides of the border well before the 50% duty actually took effect this morning. That's the quieter economic story underneath the legal drama. Companies delaying shipments, freezing inventory decisions, and rerouting supply chains based on a deadline that, until the last possible hour, could have gone in almost any direction. Whatever happens next, whether that's a court filing in the coming weeks, a signed deal that rolls today's tariff back, or further escalation under the law's own built-in authority to go beyond 50%, that pattern of preemptive caution from businesses in Ottawa, Washington, and everywhere in between is unlikely to fully ease until one of those three outcomes actually happens. The sources behind this script include the White House's own fact sheet on the Section 338 proclamations, legal analysis from the law firms Holland and Knight, White & Case, Skadden, Thomson Reuters, GHY International,